There is a narrow strip of water, just 21 miles wide at its tightest point, through which roughly 20% of the world's entire oil supply must pass. It connects the Persian Gulf to the Arabian Sea. It is guarded on one side by Oman and on the other by Iran. For decades, military strategists in Washington, Moscow, Beijing, and Tehran have understood a singular truth. Whoever controls the Strait of Hormuz holds a chokehold on the global economy. In the spring of 2026, that truth ceased to be theoretical. Iran closed the strait. The world felt it immediately. And now the United States has deployed some of its most lethal soldiers in response, elite paratroopers from the 82nd Airborne Division, men trained to drop from the sky into hostile territory and hold ground before anyone else can arrive. To understand how the world arrived at this moment, you have to go back, not weeks, but years. The collapse of nuclear negotiations in Geneva, the 12-day air conflict of 2025, the failed diplomacy, the hardening of rhetoric in both Washington and Tehran. In late December 2025, something snapped inside Iran. Its currency collapsed. Inflation had become unbearable. Shopkeepers in Tehran's Grand Bazaar took to the streets on the 28th of that month, and within days, protests had swept across the country. The Iranian government responded with lethal force. By January 8, 2026, internet access to the entire country had been severed. Human Rights Watch documented a coordinated escalation in the use of lethal force, protesters shot in the head and torso. Iran's government put the death toll at 3,117. Human rights activists counted at least 6,126 dead. The world watched, and Washington could no longer look away. President Donald Trump, speaking in Detroit on January 13, 2026, told Iranian protesters to keep fighting. He vowed punishment for security forces responsible for the killings. By late January, the United States had initiated what would become the largest military buildup in the Middle East since the 2003 invasion of Iraq. The USS Abraham Lincoln Carrier Strike Group arrived in CENTCOM's area of operations on January 26th. Guided missile destroyers, cruisers, F-35C Lightning IIs, EA-18G Growlers, the full spectrum of American naval power, began assembling in and around the Persian Gulf. In the Strait of Hormuz itself, on February 16th, Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps conducted live-fire naval drills and temporarily closed sections of the waterway. It was a rare move, one not seen since the 1980s. IRGC Commander Ali Khamenei appeared on state television and warned that U.S. warships in the Gulf could be, in his words, sunk to the bottom of the sea. Then came February 28, 2026, the day that changed everything. Under the codename Operation Epic Fury, the United States and Israel launched coordinated airstrikes across Iran. Military facilities were struck, nuclear sites were targeted, and in an act of breathtaking strategic boldness, Iran's supreme leader Ali Khamenei was killed. The strike sent shockwaves through the Islamic Republic's entire command structure. But Tehran's response was swift, and it was devastating. Within days, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps transmitted warnings via VHF radio to every vessel in the Strait of Hormuz. No ship is allowed to pass. Iran had effectively closed the world's most important maritime chokepoint. Over the weeks that followed, the IRGC attacked more than 20 merchant ships. By March 4th, the IRGC declared complete control of the strait. Over 1,000 vessels, most of them oil tankers, sat stranded. Nearly 20,000 seafarers found themselves trapped in limbo. Brent crude oil prices surged past $100 per barrel for the first time in 4 years, ultimately reaching a peak of $126. Economists began calling it the largest disruption to the global energy supply since the oil crisis of the 1970s. In Washington, the pressure to act was immense. On March 9th, Trump announced his intent to seize control of the Strait of Hormuz. On March 12th, he declared the U.S. Navy would begin escorting oil tankers through the strait as soon as possible. He called on NATO allies to assist militarily in reopening the waterway and was met with near universal rejection. Germany said no. Spain said no. Italy, Estonia, the United Kingdom, Australia, South Korea, Japan all declined. The European Union declined. For Trump, who had spent years challenging the foundations of multilateral alliance, this was a moment that laid bare the cost of damaged relationships. America, it seemed, would largely have to act alone. On March 17th, CENTCOM announced that it had deployed GBU-72 5,000-pound penetrator munitions against underground missile silos along Iran's Hormuz coastline, bunkers filled with cruise missiles and anti-ship weapons. The strike was surgical, and it was a message. The U.S. military was preparing the battlefield. On March 19th, the United States launched its formal aerial campaign to reopen the Strait of Hormuz. General Dan Kane announced the deployment of A-10 Thunderbolt II jets, the legendary tank killers of the Cold War, now retasked to destroy Iran's fast attack watercraft buzzing through the strait. Boeing AH-64, Apache attack helicopters were deployed specifically to counter Iran's one-way kamikaze drones, which had been ravaging shipping for weeks. CENTCOM published footage showing U.S. strikes destroying Iranian naval assets. The campaign was underway, but air power alone was not solving the problem. Iran was not yielding. As one former military intelligence officer, Dr. Lynette Nussbacher, stated plainly, the Iranians were winning this war on the economic front, and the only way to reverse that dynamic was to get the tankers moving again. Enter the 82nd Airborne Division. Based at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, the 82nd is the United States Army's premier airborne infantry force, the so-called All-Americans, a division forged in the fires of World War II that parachuted into Normandy, into Market Garden, into Panama. They are the global response force, the unit that can be wheels up within 18 hours of notification, capable of projecting lethal combat power anywhere on Earth before most adversaries can react. In the weeks leading up to their deployment, something telling had already happened. Elements of the 82nd had been scheduled for a major training exercise, only to have those plans abruptly canceled. The paratroopers were told to remain at Fort Bragg instead of deploying to Fort Polk, Louisiana for the drill. The Pentagon, when pressed, offered only a terse explanation citing operational security. Now we know why. The training was canceled because the 82nd was being readied for something real. On March 24, 2026, the Pentagon made it official. Between 2,000 and 3,000 U.S. Army paratroopers from the 82nd Airborne Division received written orders to deploy to the Middle East. Open-source flight tracking data identified at least 35 C-17 Globemaster military transport aircraft moving from U.S. bases toward the region, with a significant number of those flights originating directly from Fort Bragg. C-17s appeared at airfields in Israel and Jordan, as well as at bases across the Gulf Cooperation Council states. The deployment, when combined with 2 Marine Expeditionary units already steaming toward the Persian Gulf, created the possibility of 6,000 to 8,000 U.S. ground troops being positioned in close proximity to Iran, the largest concentration of American land forces in the region in years. The strategic logic behind the deployment is layered and deliberate. Military analysts and former generals have pointed to one objective above all others, Karg Island. Located just 12 miles off Iran's coast and roughly 7.7 square miles in size, Karg Island handles an estimated 90% of Iran's oil exports. It is the economic jugular of the Iranian regime. The island sits to the northwest of the Strait of Hormuz, far enough away that forces could approach and operate without having to transit the contested strait itself. Retired Lieutenant General Karen Gibson, a former Director of Intelligence for U.S. Central Command, described an amphibious operation as the most likely scenario. Former Marine Colonel Mark Cancian, now a senior advisor at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, noted that the 82nd Airborne has the ability to threaten targets in the Gulf region without directly entering the strait's killing zone. A combat jump onto Karg Island, the first such paratrooper operation since the U.S. invasion of Panama in 1989, would devastate Iran's ability to fund its war effort and signal, in unmistakable terms, that the United States was prepared to escalate on the ground. But the risks are significant, and experienced military voices have refused to minimize them. 7 U.S. troops have already been killed in Iranian attacks during the conflict, with more than 300 wounded. Karg Island sits within range of Iranian rocket artillery on the mainland. A paratrooper insertion in a contested airspace against a motivated and entrenched adversary carries inherent vulnerability. Helicopter-borne insertions face threats from Iran's surviving air defense systems. Amphibious operations leave Marines exposed while crossing open water under fire. Iran's IRGC fast boats and remaining drone capabilities, though degraded, are not yet destroyed. For any ground operation to succeed, the military calculates that sustained air preparation, the systematic destruction of Iranian coastal defenses, missile batteries, and mine stockpiles, must precede boots on the ground. Meanwhile, the diplomatic dimension has taken on its own frantic pace. The Trump administration, even as it deployed paratroopers, submitted a ceasefire proposal to Tehran through Pakistan as an intermediary, a country that maintains warm ties with both Washington and the Iranian leadership. The proposal, as reported by the New York Times and Israel's Channel 12, demanded Iran commit to never pursuing nuclear weapons and to dismantle any existing nuclear capabilities. Iran's response was immediate and defiant. On March 25th, Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi announced that Tehran rejected the American proposal outright. Iran issued its own 5 conditions: an end to all aggression, guaranteed prevention of future attacks, war reparations, a comprehensive end to conflict across all fronts, including against Hezbollah, and perhaps most provocatively, formal recognition of Iranian sovereignty over the Strait of Hormuz itself. The Iranian parliament speaker warned publicly that Tehran believed its enemies were preparing to seize an Iranian island. He was not wrong. Secretary of State Marco Rubio, speaking to foreign ministers in France on March 28th, projected confidence. The U.S., he said, was on or ahead of schedule in its operations against Iran and expected to conclude within a matter of weeks, not months. But the gap between that rhetorical confidence and the reality on the water remained vast. Over 1,000 ships were still stranded. Iran had begun operating what amounted to a waterborne toll booth, with reports emerging that regime-approved transit fees through the strait could reach as high as $2 million per vessel, a figure designed not to facilitate trade but to extort and control it. On March 26th, Iran announced it would allow ships from 5 nations, China, Russia, India, Iraq, and Pakistan, to transit freely, a calculated move to fracture the international coalition pressing for reopening. Humanitarian shipments and fertilizer were allowed through on March 27th, a concession to United Nations pressure with the spring planting season looming. Iran was not surrendering the strait, it was managing it. As of this moment, the strategic situation is a knife balanced on its edge. 35 nations have joined military consultations hosted by France on how to reopen the Strait of Hormuz once hostilities sufficiently decrease. 22 countries, including the United Kingdom, France, Germany, Japan, Bahrain, and the UAE, signed a joint statement declaring willingness to contribute to ensuring safe passage. Israel, meanwhile, struck and killed Iran's top naval commander, Alireza Tangsiri, the man overseeing the blockade, on March 26th. Israeli Defense Minister Israel Katz described him as directly responsible for the stranglehold on global shipping. The killing removes a key operational architect from Iran's maritime campaign, but Iran's capacity for asymmetric retaliation, mines, drones, fast boats, missiles, has not been fully extinguished. What the deployment of the 82nd Airborne signals above all else is that the United States has moved beyond the phase of threats and ultimatums into the phase of coercive preparation. The paratroopers are not positioned as peacekeepers. They are a rapid entry force capable of seizing terrain, holding airfields, and enabling heavier follow-on forces. Their very presence on the doorstep of the Persian Gulf forces Iranian military planners to account for scenarios that weeks ago remained hypothetical. The possibility of a combat parachute drop onto Iranian-controlled territory, something that hasn't happened in over 3 decades, is now a live variable in Tehran's strategic calculus. For a regime already reeling from the loss of its supreme leader, its navy, much of its air force, and now its top naval commander, that variable may be the most destabilizing of all. The strait remains closed. The oil remains bottled. The soldiers are in the air. And the world is watching a 21-mile corridor determine the shape of what comes next.